How to become a reader and my top book recommendations. I've had some questions lately about giving book recommendations, and rather than just write out a list, I decided to write out a list, and I'll give that in just a moment, and we'll post that later. But I thought I would make a video to kind of expound on this a little more and also help those who struggle with reading. As someone who did not start reading until I was in college, I didn't read my first book till college. I know the struggle of learning to be a good reader as an adult. And so I want to speak to those of you who did not grow up reading, who did not acquire a love for reading early on, but want to grow in your reading. I'd like to say a few things, preparatory things for that regarding becoming a reader, and then I would like to give some book recommendations. So, one of the arguments that I've heard is, why become a reader? I just forget everything I read. And this can really discourage people from becoming and putting in the work to becoming a reader because they just get frustrated that they don't remember what they read. It's understandable, but it's not the reason we read. Of course we forget most of what we read, but that's not the reason we read. The primary reason that we read is to be changed. That reading actually transforms us. Romans 12:2 says, you will be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And so reading is a primary way that God transforms our minds and transforms us through the transformation of our mind, which happens through reading. And so even if you forget many of the things you read, you are being changed in the process of reading. Now, in the short term, there are things that you will read and you will, like when I became a husband, I tried to find books on being a husband and learn as much as I could about that new role and responsibility that I had. When I became a father, and me and my wife were going to become parents, we're reading all these books on parenting. When I became a pastor, I'm reading all these books on pastoring and how do you preach and all the, and so certain books become very helpful in that moment of need in your life, and you sit at the feet of that author and you learn. And so you may not remember that 20 years later, but you'll remember parts of it likely. And in that moment, it will be very, very helpful for you. I find that my soul is revived through reading. I am deeply helped, which shows that reading is not a pure pragmatic or utilitarian action. It's not just for whatever benefit we derive from it in terms of how it affects the practicalities of our life, but it does something deeper in us. Ecclesiastes 12, I think, speaks to this. I preached out of Ecclesiastes 12 on Sunday, but I didn't get into what I'm going to say right here. Let me just bring up this passage again. Ecclesiastes 12:9. The preacher taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find, listen to this, words of delight. Words of delight. Uprightly he wrote words of truth. So the preacher's becoming an author here. And he's writing, it says, words of truth. So you have the preacher's finding words of delight, written by other authors, and writing himself words of truth. That's reading is to inspire and inform. Words of delight, inspire. Words of truth, inform. And so this is more the essence of what reading is. It's inspiring and it's informing, and it's doing those things simultaneously. And and it says that Jesus was the Logos, and Jesus said, "I am the truth." And so Christians are and will ever and forever will be people of a book, people of truth, the Logos, the truth that is our God, that is the person of Christ. We are people who love words. God has communicated to us through words. And so you have to learn how to hear words, and then behind those human words, the author or the preacher, you're listening for divine words, words from God, words from, as it says in Ecclesiastes 12, the one shepherd. And words that delight you, that lift your soul, that inspire you, that encourage you, that embolden you to go out and do what God has called you to do. And at another level, they inform and equip you to do those things better. And so you must humble yourself at the feet of these authors, often saints of old, but some still living. And remember, there is wisdom in a plurality of counselors. And so we want to read many good books because we want to learn from many good counselors. And that's what these authors are. Now, here's a warning in Ecclesiastes 12 to those who read too much, which is a possibility for someone out there, not most people. But he says, "My son, beware of anything beyond these, making of many books there is no end. And much study is a weariness of the flesh." And so you can read too much. You can lock yourself away too much and not be of benefit to anyone else. I was actually reading yesterday about Gregory of Nazianzus. He was a Christian theologian who lived in the 3rd century. It's kind of during the time of during the Roman Empire, where Constantine took power and Christianity became a state religion. He lived right during that time, and actually Gregory of Nazianzus was very, very helpful in all of the Trinitarian discussions and has written a lot on that and is actually excellent on the Trinity. But he struggled early on in his ministry because he was ordained and he was conflicted in his spirit. Part of him wanted to just kind of be alone with his book, study, pray, sing, worship, and just get away from everybody. And so he actually fled the ministry and fled everybody early in his life, and then realized that wasn't a wise choice and went back to the church to pastor because he realized at one point it hit him, what would glorify God most? What would honor Christ most? If I personally am sanctified and become more holy and pious, or if I help many other people and myself to become more pious and holy? And he concluded the latter, that it would be better to help others and not just himself. And so he headed back to the church, and he resisted the urge to do too much study that would not benefit others. And so the end of all study, the end of all reading, is love. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And so the end of all reading is that it would result in a type of living that would glorify God and benefit others. And so you can read too much if it's not resulting in that aim. And look, the most godly Christians that I've ever met have all been people who read. They're readers. And so I know a lot of Christians struggle with this, and they hear that and they wouldn't even argue that that's not true. But they say, I want to grow in reading. I want to become a better reader. I don't feel like I am. Well, here's a few practical tips. 1, pray. Have you ever prayed, Lord, help me become a reader? I think Christians should pause and before anything else, ask God to transform them and give them new desires to put away their phone, to get away from other things that are less profitable, and to become a reader, to devote time and effort into trying to cultivate a love for reading. 2, if you're not reading anything right now, you should read the Bible. Okay, don't go for other books if you're not already reading your Bible. And by the way, I'm not going to put the Bible in my recommended reading list because I'm not going to I'm not going to denigrate and degrade the Bible like that to put it in a conjunctive relationship with other human authors. The Bible is a book from a divine author. It's God's words to us, and it stands in a category of its own. So if you're not reading at all, you should start reading the Bible and then go to other books. But assuming you're already reading the Bible, I would say habit stack. So let's say you're reading the Bible faithfully. When you read the Bible, right after you get done reading the Bible, read for another 5-10 minutes another book, and stack that new habit on top of the old habit that's already solidified. That is a good way to begin to read 10-15 minutes a day, an additional book. Don't try to read an hour, 2 hours, or something you're going to fail at, but start small and work up from there. Additionally, I used to be very against audiobooks, but I've come to appreciate them much more, especially with certain genres, novels, fiction, any kind of narrative. I'll listen to the Old Testament many times on an audiobook. I still read it as well. But I find narrative portions of Scripture sometimes helpful with an audiobook, less so the epistles of Paul or something. And certainly those type of great stories. I'll get to some of those in a moment. There are just some things that are better to listen to an audiobook, and I would even say better to listen to an audiobook. Priscilla was telling me the other day how audiobooks are superior for reading to kids because you have oftentimes voice inflection and multiple authors that are reading in some stories. So that you have different characters that are kind of coming to life in an audiobook. Whereas if the child is just kind of slowly reading through that, they're not able to picture that. And it gives more, it involves their imagination more, and it really makes the book come to life. So I think in some cases, audiobooks could be better. Obviously for the pragmatic reasons of like when you're doing dishes or when you're working out or when you're in the car driving, you can put on an audiobook and you could be listening to multiple books a year just in all these multitasking, during other times in your day when otherwise you wouldn't be able to read. And then I would say buy a few really good books, great books, which I won't say what all great books are in this video. I think maybe I probably should make a video on great books. And I would say great books are great because they've stood the test of time. Christians are still buying them. They're still in print. But they're also difficult books. That's why I don't want to put them on my list. The Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin or The Bondage of the Will by Luther. These books were not difficult when they were written, but they are difficult now. Anything by John Owen or Jonathan Edwards or Francis Turretin or Stephen Charnock. These are glorious books and authors, but they're very difficult for your modern reader. And so I didn't want to make a list. I didn't want to put those type books in the list. The books I'm going to recommend are easier for your average non theologically trained scholar or your layperson. As a pastor, obviously, a lot of my reading is exegetical stuff. It's stuff it's theological works that help me understand Scripture in preparation for preaching and teaching, and so a lot of my reading is in that area. But I want to give a better recommendation list that would be more helpful to many people who don't just want all theology books. And so I'll start with theology and I'll move into some other categories. So regarding theology, this year I've been studying a lot on the doctrine of God. And so I have really loved Augustine on the Trinity is what it's called, on the Trinity. Just masterful. Augustine, I'm not going to try and summarize all these books, but that book right there really set the stage for about 1,000 years of church history on Trinitarian discussions. It was hugely influential and still is. Excellent book. Robert Leatham, The Holy Trinity, is very, very good as well. So I have, Augustine's here and Leatham's here. The Holy Trinity, these are not going to look right, I think, on video when I hold these up. But it's a large book, but excellent book on the Trinity. Bavinck is, this is a 4-volume or 5-volume set. Reformed Dogmatics. Bavinck, God in Creation is what I read this year. Really, really good. You should buy this set of systematic theology. But then there's the Existence and Attributes of God in print now with Crossway, beautifully bound here. This one on the Doctrine of God has been very helpful for me this year by Charnock. It's a 2-volume set. And I would add a practical theology book. I didn't bring it over here. Some of these are still, I didn't grab all of them. But it's called Addictions, Banquet at the Grave by Ed Welch. And this book would be extremely helpful for anybody who has an addiction they want to overcome, but also those who are trying to help those who have addictions and want to overcome them. Ed Welch, Banquet at the Grave. Now, the Christian life, there's many books I could recommend. Where did I put those? Two books that I'll just point out on the Christian life that were really helpful to me at certain moments in my Christian life. This one is very, very small little book called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness by Tim Keller. It's about humility, and he obviously argues that self-forgetfulness is the key to humility. This book really could go in marriage and parenting for me, practicing affirmation by Sam Crabtree, because it helped me as a husband and father more than probably almost any other book on marriage and parenting, but on affirmation and how to give God-centered affirmation to others. Very, very helpful books on the Christian life. Devotionally, the Puritan paperbacks, you got to mention the Puritan paperbacks. There's hundreds of these different Puritan writings. This one on the love of Christ by Richard Sibbes, I have loved. This is on the Song of Solomon, and this one is sweet to me, very meaningful. Two books on prayer. I didn't know how to pick between these two because they both are equally powerful to me. And one is called The Hidden Life of Prayer by David McIntyre. Very little book here on prayer. And then also Power Through Prayer by E.M. Bounds. And both of these, you read these for 5 minutes and you want to put it down and go pray. I mean, it just motivates you to want to go pray. Which leads to the next category of fiction. You know, I don't have the book because I listened to this on audio actually. But The Green Knight. This is a J.R. Tolkien book. Very powerful book. I was very moved and helped by J.R. Tolkien's The Green Knight. Listened to that recently and just found that to be very, very moving and helpful book to me as a fiction book. Obviously, anything by C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are going to be excellent. I think the first book of fiction I read as a Christian was Pilgrim's Progress, along with many Christians. It is the best-selling book of fiction I think ever produced, ever printed, and for good reason. Pilgrim's Progress is excellent, and so I think I read it on my honeymoon was the first time. In terms of biographies, I could give quite a few recommendations. If you want to learn more about the Reformation, Luther and Calvin, Saldermoss, he's a historian. He wrote a small book on Luther and a small book on Calvin. Both those are excellent. But my favorite book I've ever read is George Whitefield. It's a small one. There's a much larger one that's been written. But this one by Arnold Dallimore is a little condensed version. I read this every time I go to Brazil. For the last few years, or last few times we've gone to Brazil, I'll read this every time and bring it with me and reread it. And it's just excellent. On the Great Awakening, you really get an idea of the Great Awakening and then the life of George Whitefield and how God used him. I am working through right now, I'm not finished with it, but this second volume of Martin Lloyd-Jones, My Hero in the Faith, very, very encouraging to get a detailed biography on his life from Ian Murray. Let me see, Marriage and Parenting, a lot of book recommendations I could give here. Sacred Marriage is a go-to regarding just the centrality of holiness in marriage, and that marriage is really about holiness and pursuing godliness as a husband and as a wife. The Godly Home, regarding parenting, but there's some stuff on marriage here. It's in reprint now, I think, Crossway, but that's a Richard Baxter book. You've got Shepherding a Child's Heart. This is a classic, very helpful as a new parent. When I first read this, I've gone back to it a few times, recommended it many times. Ted Tripp's Shepherding a Child's Heart. What He Must Be, If He Is to Marry My Daughter by Voddie Baucham. This one really on courtship, dating kind of relationship there, how to prepare a young man to be a husband and what women should look for in a husband. Very helpful. Let me see. I've got a bunch of books just laying here. Oh, Apologetics. And I would say really on marriage and family, A Man as Priest of His Home is something we read with the men in the church this year by Sam Waldron. It's a small book, but very good book on a man's leadership in his home. A Man as Priest of His Home, I believe it's called. But Apologetics, when I was in college, this book was very helpful to me. I was in a secular college as a philosophy major. I was in a lot of classes dealing with a lot of secular arguments against Christianity. The Reason for God by Tim Keller. There's some other books that I could recommend that were helpful during that time regarding apologetics. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis was very helpful during that time as well. But in more recent years, I've really found presuppositionalism to be very helpful. Cornelius Van Til in this book, The Defense of the Faith, kind of the flagship foundational standard work on presuppositional apologetics, I would highly recommend. And then I just read a few months ago this book called Reformed Preaching by Joel Beeke, and found it to be the best book on preaching I've ever read. It's obviously he's drawing largely from the Puritan tradition, but he gets into the Reformers and even pre-Reformation preachers and does a lot of historical work on preaching. Extremely helpful book on preaching. Lectures to My Students by Spurgeon is very good. And then there's one other book I wanted to recommend for those of you who are Baptists or want to know more about the confessional Reformed Baptist tradition. This is a little book, Amidst Our Beloved Stands, a Recovering Sacrament in the Baptist Tradition by Michael Haykin. Very helpful, a very small little book, but a lot packed into this about kind of particular Reformed Baptist sacramentalism in the Baptist tradition. And I could probably recommend 5 or 6 more books on confessional and sacramental practices in the Reformed and Baptist world that I think have been very helpful to me. For anybody who would want more of those, they can reach out to me. I'm tempted to recommend more. I'm going to see how long this video has already gone. Way longer. I doubt anybody's still listening to this, but if you are, maybe I'll put out a video in the coming days on great books and try to recommend some great Christian books. But I'll just say, you can become a reader. You can. You can read as discipline and work, or as delight and leisure. But you can do it, and whatever type of reading you're doing, it is worth the time and the effort to put into it. And I do hope this video has helped you toward that end. Blessings.